So I have taken probably what was a much-needed break from all of the politics and all of the strife and challenges that we've had over this last year. In addition to giving thanks, I drove 1,000 miles each way to Montana to share Thanksgiving with family, and it was a fun time. It was an interesting and dynamic time as well. And again, it is a time when what has made me think about this, and I've done a lot of reflection, not that you guys care what my inner thoughts or workings are, but I'm going to share with you what I think is probably critical to our own thinking throughout the board, and also critical to the nation moving forward. And to that extent, perhaps it has meaning. I think many of us over this past year, and this, let's call this conversation a celebration of the year, because many of us began the year somewhat naive about the whole process. Some of you were following Q as early as last October, that is more than a year ago, 15 months ago. Some of you have been involved in alternate theories, tinfoil hat, the rest of the kind of thing, whatever you want to call it, for months or years, maybe decades. And what has happened over the last year is that we've had this fury of intensity about trying to figure out what it is, how all of these little pieces fit, how that impacts us, if it impacts us, and what it means to us both as a nation and as citizens of the world, in conflict perhaps with the greater forces that have been underlying our lives and our history for hundreds of years, and perhaps 10, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years. So what I did in the shadow of the election was to draw back and reflect. It obviously didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. And I know some of you were delighted that what Q had said was, what we wanted was the Senate and the courts. And with the Senate and the courts, everything is copacetic. I'm going to tell you I don't think that's true, but I don't know that it matters. I mean, I think, yes, is having 2 more senators helpful? Sure. Getting rid of Flake and having McCain pass, is that helpful? Sure. Is that there were others that resigned that may have been helpful to us, like Corker, and now replaced with a much stronger representative from Tennessee? Yeah, absolutely. But we've also got Willard Mittens from Utah, who is as dark a player as Flake and McCain put together, perhaps. But certainly he rivals McCain in his potential for mayhem. And I think you'll see that. I will be the predictor of it. But beyond that, and I have to tell you, as someone who has watched the court systems and the rest of that for decades, are we better off? Yeah, certainly we that believe in the Constitution, not Republicans or Democrats, but we that believe that the Constitution has an internal, consistent, unalterable viability, altered only by amendments, not by progressive rereading or by dispensing with it in pieces. Are we better standing with 2 new Supreme Court justices and a bunch of appellate court and district court people? Yes. Are there many who are sitting waiting for the Senate to approve? Yes, many of them. Does that flip the judicial process? I'm going to tell you no. I mean, you have to understand that these are all life appointments, and having 2 years of Trump there, while it has been significant in the Supreme Court because of the 2 appointments that helped to change the balance, the appellate courts, as you obviously know from the last few weeks with the Ninth Circuit, are giving Trump fits. Does that mean that he has appointed enough people to make it better? No, by a long shot, no. Is that also true in other federal appellate districts? Yes, of course it is. They're all represented by nominees of predecessors of Trump, some of whom are helpful and many of whom are not. The Obama appointments go for 8 years. There have been 2 years of Trump. And are Trump's uniformly good? No, not necessarily. But is there hopefulness about it? And I would say to you there is. And let me give you how I see us fit in the process, because that's where I had to get. I had to get to a place where I said, do we make a difference? And if so, how do we make a difference? And what I say to you is, yeah, damn right we do. And I say that because a year ago there were thousands of us, okay, who had some sense that we had been betrayed and were beginning to look at the ongoing events of our country in a more questioning, cynical, jaded perspective. The Q movement, for better or worse, and I have said this since last spring, call it a LARP, call it the magical connection with Trump, call it whatever you like. It doesn't matter for the main purpose for which I value it, and that is this. There are tens of thousands of you, maybe hundreds of thousands of you, perhaps millions of you, who now look at every event and say, is that what really happening? Does the mainstream media tell me the truth or not? If we have an assault in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, was it a real event? And there are people, if you look, who are going to tell you, no, it wasn't, even though the president went there and mourned with the people that allegedly had family members who died there. How about the event in California, the bar in California, where 60 people who supposedly were in the Mandalay Bay project also ended up, and I mean that in all seriousness, for those who may have died or been injured by it, who also ended up in the California bar. Well, the mathematical likelihood of that is almost zero, I have to tell you, unless, of course, there is some kind of methodology to it, and there are many, many others. So when we look at these and we see them come by, the question then is, are they false flags? May they be hoaxes? May they be other problems? But the fact of the matter is, and this is the most important fact to it, I mean, aside from the horrible disruptive process of it and perhaps the injuries and deaths, for the rest of us, the benefit is that we no longer see this as something which the mainstream media told us it had to be. And not only do we not see it that way, we assume from the outset that it may not be. Therefore, we look at it with skepticism. How does that make a difference to us in this lifetime? I'm going to tell you, I think it makes a vast difference. It may be the first time in hundreds of years, if not forever, certainly back to our revolutionary time, where our citizenry is conscious and jaded and questioning and skeptical about what is going on in this country and how even seemingly inconsequential events are manifestly impacting us. And when we see that, what it means to me is that as these progress, we will not go to sleep. We will not ignore them. We will not quell our voices. And should there be more, which there will be, having those bogus banners, as I call them, having these events will serve to help us educate more and more of our citizenry. And I certainly saw that in my trip to spend time with my family, because I got a chance to say to them, look here and here and here and here. And what happens even to those who are deeply skeptical of us is that they begin to say, well, maybe he has a point. Maybe there is something to it. So let's back up to where it was not that way. And most of us can recognize this even in the last 5 years. But let's go back for the last 100 years. Let's look at 1913, when in February of 1913 we supposedly passed the 16th Amendment that gave the right of income taxes to our center government. That fall, in December of 1913, in the shadow of the new election of this supposedly wise Woodrow Wilson, who was a total naive git, that we passed the Federal Reserve Act. At the end of the regular session of 1913, and while there were already people who had gone home for the holidays, they slipped it through in one day. And later on, what I would tell you is what Woodrow Wilson said about that. Let's put this in perspective. Woodrow Wilson said, quote, this is 1919, this is long after that, but while he was still in office and before his stroke, I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. How has that changed in 101 years? How has that changed? Yes, I can add. It hasn't. But here's the difference. When did you read that in the history books? When did your U.S. history teacher tell you, do you know, we made a giant mistake in 1913 and Woodrow Wilson didn't realize that he had been horribly duped until 6 years later? And not only that, students, nothing's been done about it in 101 years, even when the president recognized it. Nobody has said we need to fix the problem that somebody realized he had committed, a president of the United States, a supposedly better than average president of the United States, although I will seriously question that, in 1917. So what we have is a whole series of changes, things that you guys accepted, and I did too. We've got 1915, the Lusitania was sunk. And we say, well, gee, that was, the Germans were bad guys and they were sinking stuff they shouldn't, and this is a passenger ship. Well, we didn't realize till 1993 when we finally got down into the ocean and looked at the ocean floor where the Lusitania was, that there were, 6 million pounds of ammunition and other explosives in the hull of the Lusitania being brought to the British Commonwealth, to the Brits, to help them with the war. And the Germans had warned and tried to warn more and more, hey, look, don't be sending passenger ships over here with munitions that we're going to have to fight. Then you've got the 1916 election, where Wilson narrowly won by saying he kept us out of war. Well, he kept us out of war until April of 1917. Do you have any idea how? I mean, that we're talking about a November of 16 election and April of 1917, a declaration of war by the same guy who won by keeping us out of war. When have we seen that? Did we see it in 2001 when Bush promised us that he was going to rid us of external wars? Did we see it in 2004 when Bush claimed that he was going to clean out everything and that he was the guy to help us with fighting terrorism? Did we see it in 2008 when Obama promised that he'd get us out of Afghanistan and he would wind down Iraq? Did we see it in 2012 again? Did we see it in 2016 when President Trump promised us as the candidate that he could see no reason for us being in Iraq and Afghanistan and he was going to get us out of Syria? Yes, we've seen it. Are we more jaded now? Yeah, I think we are. So in 1917, we, the United States, became part of the war. And we dynamically changed the war from one dominated by Germany, where they were suing for peace, to one where the Germans were at a disadvantage and were losing. And when they sued, when the armistice came, the Germans were made to pay because we came into it. Who is it that promised us they would get us into the war? Who is it that promised the British that they would get the United States into the war and change the balance of powers instead of having a capitulation by the British, who were by then losing? Well, it was the Zionists who, in trade, got the Balfour Declaration in 1916, which permitted, or in 1917 it was actually formally done, where the trade-off was, we'll get the Americans into the war if you'll give us the Palestinian state that we can have for the homeland for Israel. Where have you ever read anywhere in mainstream media that that was the trade-off? Where have you ever read that thousands and thousands of American boys were going to die because of the trade-off the British made to create an Israeli state for the Zionists, who were the bankers financing World War I? Where have you ever heard that? And then you have Pearl Harbor in 1941. Everybody's told about all those awful Japanese people, the yellow race. Forgive me for even putting it that way, but that's the way it was characterized at the time, those awful evil guys were there. And we didn't realize that Franklin Roosevelt knew that that attack was coming. And in 1940, when he ran for his third term, he promised us, I will not commit our boys to a foreign war. So knowing full well that for most of 1941, he was pushing the Japanese into a corner, trying to get them to attack us. He was pushing them in the Philippines. He was pushing them and goading them with Hawaii. He was refusing to settle anything with them. They shut down with the Dutch the oil supply for the Japanese, which virtually were going to put them at a standstill within 2 years. We're teasing and taunting them with our Navy, all the while knowing what was going. And we sent our aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor, leaving the 30-year-old battleships in there so that it looked really good, and then sacrificed 3,000 men so that the American people would be angry enough to call for and demand war, where we had vehemently tried to stay out for the previous 2 years of the European War, and nobody had any interest in getting into it at all. So we've been lied to and lied to. We had the Gulf of Tonkin of 1967, when Lyndon Johnson, just like FDR and just like Woodrow Wilson, did the same thing with the false flag. And everybody said, oh boy, we've got to get into war. We've got to do this stuff. Well, let's go look at a few other things. We've got the crash of 1929. And we're told that, there were all kinds of internal things. Herbert Hoover created the tariffs and added taxes and basically brought the economy down. But who was running the economy? The economy was being run by the Federal Reserve, which had been put in 15 years before in 1913, and they helped to bring it down. They brought it down intentionally, and they had no compunction about having millions of people out of work, people standing in soup lines, hundreds of thousands of cattle and sheep plowed into the dirt and not used because the market was too low. We had thousands and thousands of people who lost their farms and ended up giving up all of their life savings and their assets. And then we did it again in 2008. And you say, well, gosh, that was, they had this mortgage problem and it was overblown, and they had combined mortgage packages and they had derivatives and Lehman's went down. I'm going to tell you, none of that was true. None of that. Yes, there were those things there, But they weren't there because knowledgeable, intelligent, rational people made logical, rational, intelligent choices which would protect and balance the country. We had guys like Alan Idiot Greenspan who said, oh, we don't need to protect against any of this. We don't need to worry about any of this because the markets will take care of themselves. Nobody would set themselves up for failure. Ha! He knew full well then, and he knew full well all along, that the Fed and the people who own the Fed were setting it up for failure, that the markets were being opened, that the mortgages were being intentionally overblown, that the inflation was tucking in behind it, and that the markets were going to crash, and they were going to make them crash so that they could reconsolidate power. Some of you have said to me, well, how could it possibly be that the people who own everything would crash their own systems and cause themselves to lose value? I'll tell you why. Because it has nothing to do with a balance sheet. Not a balance sheet at all. They don't care if they lose 4 trillion or 6 trillion or whatever it is. What they care about is who owns the pie. Okay? And before 2008, and again before 1929, although I can't give you the numbers, before 2008, the middle class, 66% of us or so were in the middle class. And we owned more homes and more equity in homes than we ever had. What happened in 2008? Well, they took away the pension and profit sharing and retirement plans. Everything crashed. The stock market crashed. People were left without plans. Plans went bankrupt. And tens of thousands of people, perhaps, a couple million people lost their homes and their jobs. And how did that change the pie? Well, the people who knew that they had control of the market bought up everything, while the people who lost everything had nothing left to invest. And it changed and diminished the middle class. And it took about a third or fourth of us out of the middle class and brought us down in wages, brought us down in income, brought us down in equity, brought us down in lots of other ways. This latest thing that has to do with the immigration stuff is not only horrible, as the president has stated, because it brings people in that destabilize and make illegal and make us not a nation of laws, but it also draws down the middle class. It drags the middle class down, and that's part of the plan. Part of the plan, folks, it's not just that we don't want MS-13 here and drugs and cartels and sex trafficking and illegal players and the rest of that coming. We want all of that not to happen. But it also, every time you bring 1 million people in here, it pulls all of the wage earners down. Anybody that makes wages makes less. And you say, well, gee, it only impacts the people at $9 or $11 an hour and the rest of that. No, that's not what it does. It pulls people out of work at $12 and $15 an hour, and it pulls them down. So if there are wage earners all across the skill level, people that are making hourly wages all across the skill level, every time you add workers at the bottom, you pull all of those people down. And the old studies that are 15 years old say that illegal immigration has caused wage earners to lose $2 an hour. That's the standard they're still saying, but I'm going to tell you it's probably twice that. And for some workers who would otherwise have been over the last 15 years, 20 years, into the $20 an hour bracket, they're still struggling at $10 or $11 or $13 an hour because there is no potential for upward mobility. And now what we have is the Federal Reserve saying, well, we've got an overblown market and we've got an overblown economy and our employment numbers are too low and we have to raise interest rates in order to draw down that hyperventilated economy, which of course is a lie as well. And raising the interest rates are going to put us another $500 billion, if not $1 trillion in annual national debt further behind. So our national debt, if President Trump, for instance, stays in office for the next 6 years, will double again. It will add another $10 trillion or more, perhaps, because when you change the interest rate, you change the payment on the debt. So all of those things are working, and that part not only discounts us, but it is a tax. Because if I have $100,000, which I don't, but if I did, and the bankers made it worth a third less by inflation, then they've basically taken $66,000, or excuse me, $33,000 away from me. They've made me a third poorer by inflating and decreasing the value of the money that I held before. And this is the most pernicious situation we've ever had, because with quantitative easing, that money that I have, that hypothetical $100,000 that would have been in the bank earning 5%, would have half offset the inflation. But you go in there now and ask for what your CD is going to earn, and it's going to earn, what, less than 1%? And so as a result, the $33,000 they're going to take away from me, or the $50,000 that they're going to take away, is not going to be offset by my investment with them in the bank. So for all these things, these are downsides. Why am I still optimistic? Because I know, dear friends, that millions of us are there looking, conscious, aware, skeptical, jaded. We are ready. We are not going to take the next little tweaky play down lying down. We're not going to do that. I am convinced of that. And not only that, we're going to tell all of our friends and neighbors when things happen, look at it another way. It isn't happening the way you think it is. And what will happen to more and more, and I am seeing and feeling and knowing this in the people to whom I am talking throughout this area, my friends, my neighbors, people with whom I write and the rest of that, more and more of them are becoming consciously aware that our government is out of control, that the systems that are problematic, and that these signs that we see all the way from the false flags to the banking system, to the foreign interventions, to the false stuff about chemical warfare in Syria and the rest of that, people are beginning to say, you know, I don't really believe that. I don't know that that's true. And what is different from 1913 or 1941 or 2001 or 2008, what is different now is that there are many, many hundreds of thousands of us aware that we are being duped, and that we are not going to take it lying down, and that we are ready to stand up and tell the rest of the country this is not what's happening. So the next time something happens here, there are a couple things that are going to happen. One is we're not going to simply submit. And number two, we are going to rally our friends, our neighbors behind us. And we are going to tell the government, A, we don't believe you. B, we're not going to tolerate what it is that you say. And C, you're going to fix it and reverse it, or the pitchforks are coming out. And of course, I say that in symbolic hyperbole. Pitchforks won't do it. But we need, as people, and I encourage all of you, I am delighted, I engage you, I thank you, I appreciate you. I want you to know that my hopefulness, my appreciation for you, is that you have come in with me to the fuller knowledge of who and where we are as a people, of who and where we are as citizens of the United States, and that it is time for us to stand up, each of us in our own way. If it simply means talking to the neighbor across the fence and saying, you know, that stuff that happened last night, well, I questioned it. I don't think it happened the way I thought. Or the guy that was at the Pittsburgh synagogue maybe doesn't exist, or there never was an arrest, or that there was a live action a drill at that same synagogue last January, which tells us something's going on. So thank you, friends. Give a thumbs up. I really, truly appreciate you. I embrace this year and wish for a new year. Peace to you.